Okay, here we go. So we welcome. This is Empower DC's Protect Emergency Rental Assistance program tenant info session and debrief. We're going to be talking all about the recent emergency legislation that passed by the council. We're going to talk about what it means, what are the impacts, what are the changes, what's happening now. And we're also going to take a moment to talk about how we even got there in the first place and how tenants can take action around these issues. So before we do all of that, though, we do have some housekeeping. So I just want to briefly review the agenda. So we're already doing our welcomes. I'm going to talk a little bit about Empower DC, our mission and our values, what drives our work. We'll do a little bit of issue framing, like I said, just to unpack how we got to this point where we're passing these emergency legislations that really limit tenant protections and speed up evictions. We will go into the ERAP legislation, all the details, what's happening. Molly's gonna do a deep dive into that. We'll do a call to action. And then I do have a special announcement of another event we're gonna have in November. And then we will open it up for questions before we close out. Again, thank you for joining us. So before I get into what Empower DC does, I do just want to go over some general meeting guidelines. We are so happy to see so many folks responded to our emails and are in the space with us. So here are just some guidelines so that we can make the most of our time together and be able to strategize as well as learn. So we all ask that if you all could mute when you're not speaking. And we do have co-hosts who can help with that. If you're not able to mute at the time, no worries, we got you. We ask that you hold your questions for the question and answer portion of today's session. If you do have a burning question that comes up as people are talking, you could put it in the chat. We'll be sure to capture that question. And when we get to the question and answer portion, we'll be sure to answer it. And I also just want to say we do appreciate, I see a lot of our advocates and supporters in the room, but we especially want to hear from residents that are directly impacted by the issues we're discussing. That is one of our values, that we are engaged in resident-led community organizing and that we honor the expertise of those most impacted by injustice. So we want to hold on to that value, not only today, but always. And so we just ask that folks be mindful of the introvert and extrovert balance and communicate in the chat when needed. And also, we're here today to deal with the facts on how this legislation arrived, who pushed it through, and we want to be really clear about who that is. This was pushed through by landlords, both nonprofit landlords and market landlords. And we also want to be clear that decision makers like Mayor Muriel Bowser and the DC Council, they're all involved in this. In fact, the council voted unanimously to pass this emergency legislation. So we just want to be clear about who our targets are as we engage in today's discussion, and engage with each other respectfully as well. And I also just want to mention that this meeting is public and it will be recorded. So if there are any personal issues that you wouldn't like to be shared in a public setting, please be sure to discuss that with a lawyer. We can definitely see what we can do to help with that. But yes, I just wanted to make that clear that this meeting is being recorded. So about Empower DC. We are a grassroots organization. We were founded in 2003 by our current executive director, Parisa Norozi, and another longtime activist, amazing activist in the housing world, Miss Linda Leaks. Our vision is DC is a state where human rights and needs are met, systemic harm is exposed and repaired, and empowered residents shape the decisions that impact their lives. Our mission is to build the power of DC residents through resident-led community organizing to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice. And I'll add to that housing justice, which brings many of us here today. Our organizational values include honoring the history, expertise, and vision of low and moderate income Black and Brown residents. Like I said, y'all, that is the vision, those most impacted by injustice. We also want to build collective power that demands accountability from decision makers. We want to disrupt inequitable and unjust systems and institutions and persist in the determined, uncompromising pursuit of justice. So now that you know a little bit about Empower DC and why we are so concerned about this legislation and its impacts and what we stand for, I'm going to pass it off to Farah to see how we even got there in the first place. So thank you so much, y'all, for joining. Farah, I pass it off to you.
Thanks, Andrea. Hey, everybody. So I just wanted to talk a little about particularly what's happened over the last few weeks. So we know that last Tuesday, the 1st, the council, as Andrea said, unanimously voted to pass this emergency bill. And this bill rolls back eviction protections and policies related to emergency rental assistance, what we've all been calling ERAP. So you'll hear a lot of us saying ERAP. These policies around ERAP that were particularly under fire were put in place during the pandemic, right? And they were put in place to make sure that people who needed it could access rental assistance, and that people weren't evicted before they could get that emergency rental assistance. So Molly's going to go into the specifics, but the basics are that it's now going to be harder for tenants to receive ERAP. Evictions may move faster. And so I want to just talk about what we've been hearing like the last few weeks. So as you can see, if you're able to look at the screen, this is just a few of the news articles, and these headlines are are examples of really all the headlines that I was seeing. A crisis in unpaid rent leads DC to roll back eviction protections. DC Council passes an emergency bill to address the unpaid rent crisis. The chairman of the council said that DC has to stop strangling housing providers by preventing evictions. So as you can see, there's been this whole narrative that the crisis that we're having is about unpaid rent. And so housing providers have been saying they are owed a lot of money. They've been saying $100 million. And that because of this huge amount of money that's owed, that some of the affordable housing developers are close to foreclosure. We know that, by the way, just under a foreclosure, tenants do stay in place in DC. But the concern is that if there was an affordable housing agreement, that can be lost during foreclosure. So we would lose low-income units. And so the city council seemed like really swayed by this, right? By this possibility that we could lose affordable housing. And I think they kind of made this leap to then say the problem is we can't evict people fast enough, or the problem is ERAP. And landlords really tried to make the case that evictions are moving too slowly. They also said that some people, may not pay rent for months and use the ERAP process intentionally to slow down the eviction process. And so these are the narratives that we were hearing, right? And so these landlords, including affordable housing providers, did a ton of lobbying. And really built this case that unpaid rents were hurting them financially. And do you want to go to the next slide, Andrea? And so the council and the press really took up their talking points and basically trusted landlords on the solution. So I just wanted to read just some of the things we were really hearing over the last couple of weeks. So the mayor said about these ERAP reforms, this is a first step in rebalancing the affordable housing ecosystem. We hope that people now recognize the consequence of non-payment of rent and the impact on the maintenance, safety, security, and production of rental housing in the district. So I'm just going to say what probably all of us are thinking, right? Like, I don't think people don't pay rent because they don't understand the consequence, right? Folks know, we all know we could lose our housing when we don't pay rent. And so this is really this whole narrative of blaming people who are being impacted by the affordable housing crisis, right? Of blaming DC residents where the housing is too expensive and our incomes don't match housing, but acting like people are just not paying. Yeah, somebody just put in the comments, wow, really criminalizing poverty, right? And these are like narratives that we've heard a lot, right? That tend to like use stereotypes, scapegoat people, put the blame, or say that like low-income people are trying to commit fraud, things like that, right? So this one news article said, it quoted industry leaders, that ERAP has been used by tenants to delay eviction proceedings while not paying rent. So kind of like this idea as though people are trying to scam the system, right? The chairperson said, basically what we're getting at is it would not be possible to continue to game the system with applications that don't pay the rent or go nowhere. Again, like blaming tenants for gaming the system. The mayor said there's a perverse incentive for people to not pay rent, while others experiencing true emergencies might not raise funds. So this is something we were hearing a lot, right? Is like the money should only go to people experiencing true emergencies. But something, is that anybody experiencing experiencing an eviction is experiencing an emergency. And the city does have enough money to actually make sure people are housed, right? But a budget is a matter of priorities. So I think somebody asked what this has to do with emergency rental assistance. Yeah, these are all of the reasons why, right? They were saying, I think it's a good question, right? They were trying to really place the blame on tenants and on ERAP. And when we really know, right, like there's an affordable housing crisis in this city. I will say the only quote that I found like challenging this was at one point, Councilmember White did have an argument with Bowser and said, I think you need to have more conversations with people struggling in this city. So that's really something that we want to talk about, is that during this process of deciding how they were going to deal with having, this huge amount of rent owed, there was this very quick process to kind of put the blame on tenants and put the blame on ERAP and not talk to actual people who are going through the eviction crisis. I didn't see one article that interviewed anybody who is actually facing an eviction. They talked a tiny bit when forced to people like Molly who actually work with tenants, right? But not to the tenants. And they didn't initially reach out to any of us. So they made these decisions. They also said that they were making these decisions without any data. So Molly will explain this, but this is emergency legislation. And so one thing we want to do is make sure that the council is hearing from tenants who are facing eviction, who are having trouble paying their rent, right? And to actually explain what's happening. I just saw Miss Imani put in the comments that she's dealing with rats and holes in her house. Those are reasons why sometimes we might withhold rent, right? And then actually have to go to court to explain our poor housing conditions to try to get repairs. So yeah, the council, the press need to actually hear from people about what is leading up to eviction, what are the real crises that people are facing, and and what can be done. And we need to really move to solutions that help us to avoid eviction in the first place, right? To really center housing as a human right. So that's why Empower DC is organizing around this, and we want to help to get folks' stories out. So we'll talk about this more, to really make sure that we're refocusing on housing as a human right and on doing what we can to prevent this situation. And we know that organizing works. DC renters have won huge campaigns, huge amounts of money in the past. We know we can do it, but we need to be louder than the landlord lobby. And we need to really focus on the council and the mayor, who are our decision makers. So I know a lot of you have questions about, I saw a ton of people asking in the chat, what's this legislation? What happened? What can I do? So we'll let Molly talk about that now, and then we'll talk about next steps.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me here today. My name is Molly Katchen. I'm a supervising attorney in the housing unit at Legal Aid DC, and we work with tenants in a variety of areas, but we have a large focus on eviction defense work. So we're in landlord-tenant court all the time, representing tenants in eviction matters. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what the emergency legislation does and the changes from the current situation. As sort of a starting point, the legislation that was passed last week is emergency legislation. So it's in place for 90 days. There will likely be some temporary legislation voted on soon, and then eventually permanent legislation. And what's important here is what we've heard is that for the permanent legislation, they will likely be holding hearings, which they did not hold prior to voting on the emergency legislation. It was a very rushed process that, transpired within, about a week and a half or so. And so it was, it was very quick. But for the permanent legislation, there will be hearings. And so it's really important for folks to come out and testify at those hearings, for DC council members to hear from your experiences, hear from tenants, and hear from who this is directly impacting, because that is going to be persuasive in trying to push changes to the legislation that we think is best for tenants. And so what the legislation does is sort of makes two changes in two big areas. First, it makes changes to the ERAP application process itself. So it narrows the definition of emergency so that it narrows the definition of emergency that was expanded during the pandemic. And so the definition of emergency to qualify for emergency rental assistance is a situation now. Well, the legislation, to take one step back, the legislation has been passed. It's been transmitted to the mayor for signature, but as of today, it has not been signed yet. And so it is not currently law, but as soon as the mayor signs it, it will become law. So it changes the definition of emergency,
Hold on one second.
narrowing
I
it.
just have one. Can I don't mean to interrupt you, but you said something that confused me a little bit, because you said it's temporary, right? And then people have to come out and speak the next time they vote on it. So how could she sign it? Would it?
So DC has a somewhat complicated system of legislating, and I'm not an expert on it. So but the way it works basically is the council can pass what's called emergency legislation, and that legislation is in effect for 90 days. And then they can pass temporary legislation, which is in effect for longer than 90 days, but is not permanent. And then there would be permanent legislation. And so there will be hearings on the permanent legislation. And so that's when we need folks to come out and testify, because changes can be made at those different stages of the process. And so that's when we need folks to come out and testify to try to convince the council to roll back some of these changes that they're trying to implement.
Thank you.
Does that clarify things?
It does. Thank you so much.
Sure. So under the emergency legislation, the definition of emergency is a situation in which immediate action is necessary to avoid homelessness or avoid eviction, which is the result of an unforeseen or unusual event, such as the loss of a job or a high medical cost. So the unforeseen or unusual event is what we see as sort of narrowing this definition of emergency slightly. The other change to the process, the ERAP application process, is that during the pandemic, council legislation was passed to allow tenants to self-certify different pieces of the required documentation if they weren't able to produce those documents in order to get ERAP. That self-certification will be repealed when the emergency goes into effect. And so tenants will have to produce all of the required documentations. There is an exception in that for the documentation of the emergency itself. So there's an exception put in that says if a tenant is unable to document the nature of the emergency, the tenant can submit a declaration explaining the nature of the emergency and the reason why the tenant can't document it. So we were able to get a little bit of an exception carved out, but for the most part, documentation for every other aspect of it is going to be required. The other big changes that the emergency implements is regarding eviction proceedings themselves. Under what is law today but may not be law tomorrow, if you have a pending ERAP application, all eviction proceedings have to be stayed, which means put on pause. Nothing can happen in an eviction case. A tenant cannot be evicted if they have a pending ERAP application. And what the emergency legislation did is to limit those stays and to say that the court, so under the current legislation, and it's a little bit confusing because it's current today, but it may not be current tomorrow. We don't know when the mayor's going to sign it. That stay is a mandatory stay. So the courts do not have any discretion. If a tenant has a pending ERAP application, their case must be put on hold. Under the emergency bill that was passed, that's no longer a mandatory stay. The language says the court may stay any non-payment of rent proceeding if the tenant has a pending ERAP application, but limits that stay to say the court can only stay proceedings under this section once during the pendency of that case. There is an exception, or not an exception, but a clarification to say the court is not limited in its discretion to extend or continue a stay, but the court cannot put in a second stay in a case. And where that comes into play is if a tenant applies for ERAP, their ERAP application is denied for some reason. Oftentimes what we see in court is it may be denied because the landlord didn't provide documents, or the landlord didn't respond to a tenant's request for a payment plan, or respond at all for a tenant to see if they can resolve their non-payment of rent balance through ERAP. And so that application gets denied because there's a 45-day window during which an ERAP application has to be processed. And if all the paperwork is not completed in that 45-day window, the application gets denied. A tenant, during the next quarterly opening of the portal, a tenant could apply again for ERAP, and then the case would have to get stayed again to give the tenant and landlord another chance to try to work it out. That is no longer the case. The tenant is only entitled to a stay for one ERAP application during the pendency of their eviction case. The other change that it makes to eviction proceedings is that for instances when an eviction has already been scheduled, so a judgment has been entered and there's been an eviction date scheduled, it says that the landlord shall reschedule the eviction if the tenant has an approved ERAP application that would resolve the full balance. Previous language said pending ERAP application, but now the application has to have been approved for a landlord to have to reschedule the eviction if they're notified within 40 hours prior to the scheduled eviction date. So that changes from pending to approved is pretty significant, because it would mean that you have to have already applied for ERAP and been approved for the eviction to be rescheduled under that provision of the statute. So at this point, as I said, this is not law yet, but will be law very soon. It's going to be in place for 90 days. And then depending on what happens with temporary and emergency, this could be the law. We are hoping that we can get some additional amendments and changes in there, because we think this is going to significantly increase evictions for tenants whose cases might have been resolved from ERAP, but there's no requirement that eviction proceedings stop while their ERAP application is processed if it happens more than once. And as many of you, if anyone has ever applied for ERAP, may know that once you apply for ERAP, a tenant submits their documentation, they provide everything they needed, and then they have to wait, right, for their landlord to respond and their landlord to turn over documents and their landlord to participate. And so, we feel like this legislation doesn't account for many of the instances where we see landlords not participating in the process and the tenant being denied through no fault of their own. And that is very problematic. So those are sort of the big major changes right now to the legislation. I will say that, because it's not law yet, I can't tell you how the court's going to interpret these different things, right? We sort of have to see how it plays out, but those are what the changes are on paper.
Molly, could you just talk just a little bit about the mayor closing the portal?
Sure. I can tell you what I know, which is that the ERAP portal was supposed to open on October 1st, which was the same day that this emergency legislation was voted on. We learned, I think, the Thursday or Friday before that Tuesday that they were not going to open the portal because of changes to the ERAP program. We have not been told when the portal is going to be reopened. The DHS website says they will give 14 or 15 days notice prior to a new scheduled opening date, but we don't know anything else about that right now. The ERAP website also seems to suggest that the portal is just going to remain open as opposed to the quarterly system that was previously in effect. So for the last 9-12 months or so, I'm not sure exactly, the portal has been opening quarterly for a set number of applications and closing. But now it seems like they might be reverting back to the way it was sort of pre-pandemic, when it stayed open until it ran out of money. but we don't really have a lot of specifics. We don't have any information about when the mayor is going to reopen the portal. But it is concerning and problematic that this was done so quickly, and that they're not giving folks information about when it's going to reopen, because there's been a lot of folks who've been waiting because the portal hasn't been open since July to apply for emergency rental assistance who really need it and are essentially being closed out of that process right now.
As we understand it, also applications that were already submitted prior in the last portal opening are being processed. So, they all do take a long time, but as we understand it, they are still being processed for those who may have an application already in.
Yes, if you have already applied for ERAP and you have a pending application, the change to the portal and ERAP opening shouldn't impact you. I see some
Yeah, there's a
bunch
few.
of chats. I don't know if I haven't been able to follow the questions. I don't know if we want to keep going and I can try to look at them and then respond at the end, or there's
No worries. We've been
specific questions to clarify things. I'm happy to do that. I know this is a little bit confusing. It's confusing for me too. It all happened very quickly and we're still trying to sort of process how it's all going to play out.
There's a couple clarifications maybe you could take. One is, can you restate what documentation is required for an emergency? What are the circumstances that are acceptable? The person asked.
So I'm sorry, what's the question?
Basically, like what constitutes an emergency and how do you show it?
So I'm not sure I can give you a specific answer on that. I think it depends. What the legislation says is that an emergency is a result of an unforeseen or unusual event. They give examples such as loss of a job or high medical costs. It's not an exhaustive list, but I think it would have to be some sort of unforeseen or unusual event that happened that caused a tenant to fall behind in rent.
Yeah, and in the past, they basically wanted you to show that once you got ERAP, you could continue to pay your rent in full on an ongoing basis. So you had to show there was like some event that interrupted that and that in the future you could continue to. And they did, the documentation I think is still iffy, and as Molly said, there's exceptions to it. So one person asked, so if the landlord does not turn in documents, then they can evict the individual?
So if a landlord doesn't turn in the documents, the ERAP application would be denied, and then the court case would proceed, right? So in DC, right, a landlord can't evict you without going through the court process. So the ERAP stay would be lifted and the court case would proceed. What arguments could be made in the court case around that, that's sort of an individual basis. But if an ERAP application is denied, then a landlord can proceed with the eviction case. And it is possible that a tenant could be evicted following litigation of their case and a trial and judgment being entered.
Well, thank you so much, Molly, for answering all those questions. We definitely can get to the rest at the Q&A portion, but I do think those were important clarifications to make right now. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you so much for sharing all that information. I'm gonna go ahead and share, or actually, I'm tripping. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off to Daniel for our call to action. And I'll share my screen, Daniel, so you can have the.
Thank you.
I'm so used to running these myself. Okay.
Well, I don't think I have to say a whole lot because I see this chat and the chat is on fire. Folks are fired up, and I think that was part of our goal this evening is to hopefully, let folks know if you weren't clear or didn't know what happened, and in hopes that moves you to some action. This is pretty small, but I'll share. This is what Mendelson, who is the chair, Phil Mendelson, who is the chair of the DC Council, sent out in his newsletter right before they voted on this. And I'll just read that first sentence in the second bullet. They were also voting on the Red Black Salamander Official Amphibian Designation Act on the same day. I found that a little funny. But he says, we have worked with affordable housing providers and the Department of Human Services to develop legislation that makes targeted changes we hope will offer important relief to providers and address issues with the ERAP program that date from pandemic era regulations. There's not one word about tenants there. There's not one word about how we're dealing with really high rents. There's no mention about people living in terrible conditions that oftentimes will cause them to withhold their rent in order to get some fixes made, right? So I think Farah had mentioned this earlier, right? There's just tenant voice and the impact this will have on tenant has really not been considered. They've done some lip service and say, yes, we're going to figure it out. When somebody asked the mayor at a press conference on this, what are we going to do with all these folks that will not be able to pay their rent and will not get ERAP? She's like, well, this will teach them to pay their rent, essentially, right? Is a response that we've gotten. So we know that at this point in time, we need to organize. And Empower DC is an organizing group. We believe, as mentioned earlier, that directly affected people are the ones whose voices we should be listening to and whose lead we should be following. So over the next couple of months, we are going to be working with our base, our members. We are a membership-based organization, and we hope that many of you will join us. You can join us by attending our meetings and just, helping us create some of the work that we need to do and of course, taking on that work. So we are, Andrea is going to be talking a lot about that, but we really do feel that it's important that we begin to organize and bring back those times when DC was really a city that did invest in tenant protections, right? That did develop really great tenant laws because renters, tenants, directly affected people organized and won those things, right? We won the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act because tenants were sick of their, big business buying up their buildings, and they got together and said, no, we need this new law. We got any of the gains that have been made is because residents, tenants, renters, supporters like yourselves in this meeting worked together, organized, and said, no, we've got to figure out a way to put pressure on them and bring our voices back into the conversation. So we really do hope that you stay in touch with us. You should have all of our contact information. I know Andrea is really good about sending summaries of what was discussed, ways you can get in contact with us. So we really urge you at this point in time to, to know that there are organizations like ours, there are other organizations that are doing organizing work, and we're trying to work closely along with them as well. We're glad and thankful to have organizations like Legal Aid and Molly working with us to really explain the legal process of this. And now, because, as Molly mentioned, this happened real quick. It's all been coming for a long time, right? It's all been coming because ever since COVID, when the world became a little more sensitive to the plight of low-income folks, the other side has been saying, wait a sec, they're getting away with too much. Tenant protections, that's going to cost us some money, right? Because this is a capitalist system. So we have to make sure that we reinvigorate and support directly affected people to raise up their voices and make sure that we are interjecting ourselves in this process. So with that said, I think our advice really is organize, organize, organize. And we really do hope to be an organization that can help you to do that and support you with that. Andrea is going to lead us through a couple of next steps that we're taking, but please make sure to follow the work that we are doing. and let us know what ideas you have and what supports you need in getting those ideas and actions, to become a reality. So thank you all once again for joining this evening, and Andrea is going to lead us through some next steps.
Thank you, Daniel. So yeah, as you heard this evening, and as many of you shared in the chat, landlords, folks who are putting profit over people, they're out here, they're organized, and they are in the ears of our decisioners, spreading harmful narratives that really blame tenants and, just blame residents for the experiences that, the impacts that of the city's failure to address the affordable housing crisis. They're blaming tenants that are directly impacted by these issues for their own failures. So we need to get organized. As Daniel said, tenants need to insert their voices into the system, and, we need to change that story. So I do want to offer some of the things that Empower DC is planning, some opportunities for folks to get involved in this work and take action. And so the first will be the tenant speak out that we are going to have on November 9th at 11 a.m. It's going to be at the United Church of Christ, which is on 945 G Street Northwest. And this is really just an opportunity for folks to share their story, not only about how this particular legislation is impacting them, but how housing and displacement as a whole has impacted folks in DC. Like we said, we are very interested and we prioritize the experiences and the knowledge of tenants. So not only do we want to capture those experiences, we also want to capture the ways that folks have organized in the past. We want to hear your ideas. We want to hear what solutions that we should be seeing as far as housing justice in DC. And, I do want to say that we do plan to invite decision makers to this, but with the caveat that they cannot speak and talk about their campaigns. It is not a PR front. You are not going to be here to, speak at tenants. This is your opportunity, council members' opportunity to listen to the voices that they've ignored for so long. So we hope that you will join us. At the end, I will share our contact information so that you can stay in touch. And, I always be sending the emails and the text, so you will get plenty of reminders before November 9th to be able to join us. And I do also want to say that for folks who, for directly impacted residents who do agree to share their story and are open to having this story be shared with decision makers, we will be offering compensation, and there will be childcare at the event. So please bring your folks, your neighbors, your family, bring everyone out. We want to hear from you. And I do also want to say that this is just the beginning. This is not going to be the only speak out we have. We definitely want to continue bringing tenant voices, inserting tenant voices anywhere we can. So we can organize tenant speak outs at the Wilson Building. We can bring it to their backyard. We can do it wherever. So we really want to be that space for y'all to to organize, and we just want to be supporting that work and a platform for you to do that. So I also would love to hear in the chat if you do have any other ideas for actions, or any other targets that we should be, or people that we should be thinking about who need to hear these messages as well. And with that being said, I am going to open it up for Q&A because there might be some more questions that we didn't get to earlier. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Excuse me, y'all. It's a late evening. And I will let folks come off mute and share their questions.
I think we should maybe add, I think Farah, you had mentioned that the mayor, or at least DHS, has said they will give 12-day notice before the portal is to open, and maybe that number is wrong, but
Yeah, I think they've been saying 15 days notice before
think
the
this says
ERAP portal
15.
opens.
Okay, so yeah, so folks who, are waiting to apply, as soon as we hear something, we'll of course make sure to email you. But hopefully there is some good lead time to let you know when the portal will actually open.
Excuse me, I have a quick question. I actually applied for ERAP and my application was accepted through ERAP. It was accepted through a case manager. However, I ended up getting another email and it was accepted through Urban Washington League. The case manager told me bring all my information up there, took all my paperwork, took everything that I supposed to have brought to them far as to, get the help that I need with my ERAP. And next thing you know, I didn't even get an email from Washington Urban League or not even from the case manager. No one has contacted me, but for some reason, my landlord ended up getting in contact with someone from Washington Urban League. The case manager there was no longer he's no longer working there. He's never sent out no paperwork to me to inform me, let me know what was needed to be back the upload. I kept checking the website. Yeah, everything on the website file is on the application file on my end showed me that everything was uploaded, but apparently nothing was uploaded on the app, on the ERAP app. So now I had ended up getting an email saying from ERAP that my application was abandoned because nothing was uploaded. And I'm sure on our end with my case manager, me and my case manager, we both uploaded my documents. We scanned in paperwork, loaded the documents and everything into the up on the computer, and that was my result. And now I'm here on the Zoom.
Ms. Jackson, we should, I'm pretty sure we have your contact information, but let us follow up with you. We'll need to speak with some of the folks we know handle applications and can maybe give us some direction. As I mentioned, as we understand it, they're supposed to still be working on these applications and processing them. It does sound like this was like, somebody just, quit and fell asleep at the wheel or something like that. And your application unfortunately suffered for that. But if you'd like to, chat us your contact information, which it'll just be easier than us having to track it down on our registration list. We'll make sure to follow up with you as soon as possible.
Thank you so much. I put all my information in the chat text. It's followed with my email and my number.
Great.
Thank you.
And Andrea or Daniel, do you have the landlord tenant resource line? I was thinking we should put that in the chat because a number of people have asked about legal supports and just questions. And I think that's probably the best place in general, for people to go, right?
Yeah.
I can drop it in the chat.
Oh, Miss Tania.
Hi, I have a question. Has the clause 11 on ERAP changed? When ERAP first came out, clause 11 stated that the landlord was not able to collect emergency rental assistance funds if the unit was out of code, housing code, or had housing code violations. Has that changed?
Clause 11 where in the
So when I
ERAP
filled out for
statute?
ERA, like it said, like I guess the guidelines for you to be able to qualify for it, and it has a list of things that state why you can qualify for it. And I noticed at the time that clause 11 stated that my unit was out of code. And when I told my third party rep from Trinity this situation, he told me that I had to work that out with the landlord essentially, but there was nothing to work out because they wanted basically all of this money. They didn't even want to meet me halfway despite my unit being out of code. And I think a lot of people, a lot of times when we're in these situations, we're in what, our tenants association has described as survivor's mode. And we're not reading through that paperwork and, seeing that there are things in there that can somewhat be of a protective use to us.
So the emergency legislation that was passed on Tuesday doesn't address that particular point. I would have to look back at the legislation to see if that, I don't know how long ago that was, if that's still in effect. So I can't answer that off the top of my head. But it's
Sure, no.
nothing in the emergency legislation that speaks to that.
Okay, thank you.
And we've saved all the questions. We're copying them and saving them in a document. So the ones that may need a little more attention and some research, we'll make sure to do that and get back to everyone, because hopefully everyone can use that information. So hopefully, we'll be able to find it and respond soon.
Is there any other questions we missed? Oh, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Victor Booth. I'm a real estate agent, landlord in DC. I do rent to the ERAP program, have in the past, so the inspections are something we have to make sure our units are up to code in order to continue to receive that money. I think we need to address also the catalyst for the crisis that we face in the city as far as this eviction in favor of the landlords. These programs pay a lot of money. They pay more than what a person who works a 9 to 5 can pay. And I recall, in 2000, we had a health emergency. That health emergency was the catalyst for today's emergency legislation. They claimed that everybody was non-essential. Those who were non-essential had to stay home. This impacted Black women, Black, brown, yellow, and white, poor women in the city. They lost their jobs, they lost their cell phones. Consequently, we see the crime going up. I was active. I went downtown to talk to the council. Their phones were blowing up because when the president ended COVID, all these people who were receiving aid from the government, all of a sudden that stopped. That's food stamps and whatnot. But as a landlord, during the COVID stuff, we couldn't evict anybody. And that was encouraged in New York, Connecticut. A lot of landlords were just going under. So I'm kind of curious to find out what landlords, like, a guy like me, I wouldn't be pushing the mayor to evict people. But, these must be the larger developers that have come into the city to raise these rents to put people out. I think we should be looking at, charging them with RICO Act. This mayor, this whole city council, they've been colluding with big business, as we can see. Empower DC has been very vocal in trying to stop a lot of the, I call Negro removal stuff in the city. But that health emergency put these people in as a painted a target on them. And now they're giving the landlords the right to evict. But they do have the money. They have the resources. And I'll close with this. In August, I didn't get my money for my tenant. So they had to pay me in September. It's August and September, so they had to pay me twice. And I didn't get, like the woman just talked about, she didn't get a notice for her ERAP application. No one followed up. So housing contracts with the Washington Urban League, and that's where you can have a lot of running around, a lot of nobody knows what's going on. But, housing never sent a notice to us saying that we weren't getting paid. So, as a real estate agent, when I've done business with HPAP has to get the money from the government. If you have a deal ready to go to settlement, if they haven't cut that check to Washington Urban League, that settlement doesn't go through. So when I saw that they contracted with Urban League, I'm not surprised that we didn't get paid. And this is like every year they do this, because your tenant has to be recertified. So my tenant has another 2 years on the contract. And if they had not started paying for this tenant, I have no recourse but to look at that tenant's tax return and reduce the rent to what she could afford. So, that's a remedy for that, because, ERAP and all these programs are a failure. they give them only 2 years, but we can't evict because the landlord tenant laws are pretty tough. So the remedy for me would be, as I told my client, my tenant, I would just adjust it based on what you can pay.
Thank you, Mr. Victor. You raised a lot of really good points. I think, yeah, there's a lot to do, right?
Yes,
And
thank
I was-
you, that landlord, because I would love to rent from you.
Yeah, right. I was thinking too, one of the issues he raised is just about there's a lot of issues with the DC government agencies, right? And instead of like all the blame being put on tenants, we know the DHS, as the previous person talked about, right? There can also be a lot of problems with the process at DHS. So I think a lot of, this is why like you all's stories are so important. And, and having landlords would be super important to talk about. As you said, like, this is how I work with my tenants, right? Because, we do live in a society where things happen. So being able to explain, here's how we can work together. And that attention we need to put on the agencies. You raised a bunch of other good points, so we'll keep track of those. Thank you. Yeah, and I just wanted to again encourage folks to come on the 9th. As Andrea said, we'll definitely be inviting decision makers. So that's the council. Well, we can invite the mayor. I feel like it's unlikely that she'll come, but hey, we can invite her and her staff. And as well as the press, because also we just saw that there was this huge role of really pushing this narrative that was really blaming tenants. So we definitely want to get you all's stories about what is actually happening and your ideas for solutions, right? For really like, what does the city need to be doing to make sure that folks aren't facing eviction in the first place? And then from there, we'll also, as I think Andrea mentioned this a bit, talk about how to take this to the council, to those decision makers, right? So maybe that's speak outs at the council, doing meetings or visits with our council members. And we have this opportunity to make this legislation better, but also really to push for, the kinds of solutions that we need in the long run and right now.
Is there
And
like a
just to add to that, the initial version of this legislation that was circulated as temporary was worse than what was passed, right? So there was mobilization. It wasn't, it was very fast. We didn't get everything we wanted in there, but it just shows that like if folks come out and tell their stories, we can get change, we can get, changes. And so I think there is hope that we can get a better version of the permanent because we got a slightly better version of the emergency. It's still very problematic and harmful for tenants for a number of reasons, and we're not thrilled about it, but it's better than what was initially circulated. And so I think that is an important thing to keep in mind in terms of mobilizing efforts, because I think hopefully we can get, an even better version of the permanent if folks come out and tell their stories and show council how important this issue is to DC tenants.
You said it, Molly. Is there any other, I see another question in the chat. Short digestible pages that describe what's happening. Yes, Jews United for Justice released some things, and also I think Legal Aid also has a letter that they submitted to the council that really describes this issue. Are we able to we can send that out in a follow-up email, and yeah, we'll get it to you. We'll get it to you in a follow-up email.
And we hope to also have, so the letter was written pre-emergency, sort of big picture changes, all of our concerns with what was circulated as the permanent. I think we're hoping to also have kind of like a shorter explanation of what the new legislation actually does. We just don't have it yet, but hopefully soon.
Yeah, these things happen fast, y'all, so.
Well, we looking forward to the meeting and the change. Hopefully the decision makers hear us and hear us out, because most of the people I've been also I lived in the shelter at one time in DC, and I managed to make it out. I had my federal voucher for over 8 years. I've been working ever since. I always kept a job, but sometimes it be hardships come along. Like last year, a lot of people was victimized from the kid thefts, like the people stealing people cars. Like for instance, I was one of them. My car got stolen. Before that, I had to cancel my car insurance because I had to pay double back rent. Like when COVID and all that came, it was helpful in a way, but then it wasn't because it also like it they wasn't evicting people. People was paying rent, but you got some people that's withholding not paying rent because the some of these private landlords don't want to change the carpet. Over 5 years, we could be in the apartment for 5 years. Stuff get on the carpet, woo, 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 whatever, whatever. The landlords don't want to change the carpet. You got mold on the walls. Like I got pictures, proof of everything in my unit. And I got a real reason to withhold my payments, but I don't. I try not to. The only reason why I withheld my payments was because I literally fell up under a depression when my car got stolen because my vehicle was a part of my livelihood, it's a part of my job. So it kind of like slowed my money up. It made me have loss of income. Hours changed when Medicaid. I worked through Medicaid. Also, Medicaid cut hours back after the whole payout through the COVID essential paying the essential workers. The payout it's a lot. It's a lot, and it just feels like we supposed to have all these help do all these organizations, all these different organizations, like for instance, Catholic Charities, Washington Urban League, all these is resources, places for us to go and get the help, but it's never the help. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't, and it cannot possibly be the tenants because it has to be the people that's working behind the scenes because it's no way that the tenants have any type of control over no payouts from the government. So I even witnessed multiple people, like people I didn't see multiple people go to these resources places and misuse and abuse the program and make it hard for people like us right here that's on this web or that's on this Zoom right now. So something really has to give when we go to this meeting. I hope and pray that they really listen and make the change because it's a lot of working moms out here that do need the extra help sometimes. That's just all I'm saying.
Well, I know we got one story for the ninth. Miss Rochelle, you need to be there. We'll help you get there.
Yeah, I'm gonna be there for sure.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Yes. And like you said, this is a lot of things that tenants don't have control over. So I'm just so glad that you pointed that out because that's what it is. We're seeing tenants getting blamed for things that are really their job. Like, it's not in your hands. So I just wanted to point that out and I'm glad you pointed it out. Miss Rogers, I saw, do you have a question? You had your hand raised earlier or?
I did. I want to say something, but you said that this is going to be online.
It is. If you want to just follow up in the chat, if it's something you don't want to be public, that's totally fine too.
But there's an action that is coming up that somewhat addresses what you all are talking about and whatnot. But if we talk about this essentially online right now, then it reveals the day and the timing of the event and whatnot. And so I would like to give you those details to be able to share with the people on this call so that they can show up and represent themselves in the situation that we're talking about today.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. And
No
I
problem.
see. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Any other questions? We still got a little time. We actually are early.
Yeah, I think this is Victor again. I guess I know when they got that crime bill done, I was, I think it was around the spring a year ago or so, and all the police chiefs were present. You had to have, I guess, get on the list like at a club, women's night or whatever, but anyway, I couldn't get in in this meeting, but I did watch it or listen to it, and I heard one police chief talk about how the people in DC were in a state of crisis. He said these people are in a state of crisis. So when you pull the food stamps away, you take children who supposedly weren't susceptible to COVID, and you shut down the schools and they watch things like, the games where they can Grand Theft Auto, and then they actually come out and do that stuff. I mean, they put these people in crisis. And I think that's why I say we have to charge these schools with the RICO Act. The mayor should be indicted along with the council for this fake emergency they put out that shut down businesses in DC. There was one gentleman on YouTube, he was showing how that, how there was no activity on K Street. There was nothing. All that was missing from his video was tumbleweed rolling down K Street and M Street and all these places. Because they shut down business, and so I mean, you have people who can't afford anything if they don't have a place to go to work, and our children, if you don't go to an office building and support those area businesses, then where are our children going to have a summer job? So this is. As a real estate agent, we have to look at the demographics. What supports commercial buildings is a vibrant community, people that can work. If they don't have any jobs, then the commercial properties go down in value, or they just get boarded up. And the mayor's solution, along with all these dum-dums in these different cities, is to turn those buildings into housing. So it's like they create the problem. I call amnegronesia. And then they come with these crazy solutions. Oh, like we're going to just lock up people for standing on the street talking. We're going to be able to chase you down. I mean, this is a dystopian environment. And I want to know, we got to find out the power. The mayor doesn't wield any power. Power doesn't care who we vote for. These people are taking orders from somebody. And like you said, this was pushed by landlords, but it can't be from people like myself. It would have to be from these large developers, because during COVID, since it was such a contagion, construction continued unabated.
Yes.
We got to ask those kind of questions. How did that happen? I mean, I went to Cuba recently, and the same thing is there. All the businesses are shut down, and all the young people are leaving the city. So
Mr. Booth, we're going to have to, I apologize to cut you off. I appreciate all the wisdom that you've been sharing, but we are going to have to keep it moving. But if you want to continue your thought in the chat, we would definitely welcome that. I apologize to cut you off, but I just want to get us to the next step so folks know how to stay involved, and we'll stay in touch. So I'm just going to share my screen one last time so that we can move on to the next steps. All right. So, like we said before, and like Farah also mentioned, we are going to be having our in-person tenant speak out on November 9th. That is going to be at 11 a.m. at United Church of Christ. That's located on 945 G Street Northwest. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize it now or scribble or rush to write it down or anything. I will send it out. You will get tons of reminders, so don't worry.
And that's right next to the MLK library. So y'all know the big library right next door.
Yes, look for the library. Thank you, Farah. And childcare and compensation will be provided, as I mentioned earlier. I do just want to share some ways that you can keep in touch with our housing justice work. So if you go to the Empower DC website, that's empowerdc.org. You can go to the tab that says campaigns, and then the tab that says housing justice, which is right underneath. And then that'll lead you to our different buckets of housing work. We have our anti-displacement network, our public housing power work, or social housing, which is another way to expand affordable housing in DC. And we just had an info session on it, so you can check out our YouTube page to learn more about that. And you can follow us on our socials at Empower DC. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, or you can also reach out to Daniel. Farah, I don't know, you can also put your email in the chat. But yes, thank you so much for joining us this evening, y'all. I mean, really, this was such fast legislation. So, you know, I appreciate Molly, you coming out and being able to discuss it. And I appreciate you all being able to spend time with us this evening. And we really hope that you will join us to share your story and be able to fight against these harmful narratives that are doing nothing to address DC's affordable housing crisis. With that being said, thanks again for joining us, and we will see you very soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.